The village of Ashwick had 17 respectable households, and Evelyn Price had been turned away from all 17 of them by the time the light began to fail. She had started at the far end of the high street, at the Holloways, where the cook had once bought her dried lavender without complaint. That was in September. It was November now, and the cook opened the door only wide enough to see who was standing on the step, and then opened it no wider. "Miss Price," the cook said, "good afternoon." "Mrs. Gill. I have the elderberry syrup you mentioned last. We won't be needing it." The door closed. Evelyn stood on the step for a moment with her basket on her arm and the cold coming in off the fields, and did not allow herself to think anything at all. That was the trick she had learned in the tea. Were years since her mother had died and her father had drunk himself past saving, and the house had been sold to pay men who had waited with remarkable patience for exactly that outcome. You did not think. You counted. She counted to 3, repositioned the basket, and went on to the Murchisons. The Murchisons' housekeeper did not open the door at all. She spoke through it. "We've had word," the housekeeper said, from somewhere behind the painted wood, "about your situation. I'm sorry, Miss Price. We can't." Evelyn did not ask what word, or from whom, or what her situation was supposed to be. She knew. It was the same word that had been traveling through Ashwick for the better part of a fortnight, moving the way such words always moved, from drawing room to kitchen to market stall, gathering weight as it went. Her mother had been Lady Bellington before she married. Lady Bellington had died under what the word called suspicious circumstances. The word did not specify the nature of the suspicion. It did not need to. Suspicion was enough. She went to the Farrells and the Atwoods, and old Mr. Pell's establishment on the corner, where she had sold 20 jars of rosehip tincture in October and been told the quality was the best in the county. Mr. Pell's manservant told her Mr. Pell was not receiving. Through the parlor window she could see the back of Mr. Pell's head, perfectly stationary in his usual chair. By the time she reached the far end of the village she had been turned away from the grocer, the vicar's housekeeper, 2 farmhouses on the Tenterden road, and a woman who had flagged her down only last week to ask whether she had anything for a child's cough. She had something for a child's cough. The woman looked at her basket and then at her face and said she had managed to find something elsewhere. "Thank you. Good day." The cold was thorough by then. It had come up from the ground through her boot soles, which were thin, and settled into her feet as something past discomfort and approaching numbness. She had eaten the heel of a loaf that morning and nothing since. She had learned that hunger past a certain point grew quiet, which was not the same as going away. It only made the cold worse and the counting harder to hold on to. She stopped at the edge of the market square and counted to 5 instead of 3, because 3 was not sufficient anymore. The basket held 6 bottles of elderberry syrup, 2 tins of dried chamomile, and a paper parcel of prepared willow bark. The elderberry syrup had taken her 3 days to make properly. It would keep for another month. After that it would begin to turn and she would have lost the blackberries, the thyme, the fuel for the stove, and the last of the beeswax she had used to seal the stoppers. She could not afford to lose any of those things. She was aware of this in the precise, itemized way of a person who has learned to keep running accounts in her head because the margin is too small for imprecision. Winter's apothecary shop was the last establishment on her list. She had been avoiding it. Mr. Winters was not unkind, which meant that being refused by him would be worse than being refused by people who were. She went in. The shop smelled of camphor and dried herbs and the particular dusty warmth of a room where the stove had been burning all day. Mr. Winters was behind his counter, reading something over his spectacles, and he looked up when she came in and his face did the thing she had stopped being surprised by, a brief, involuntary movement, some private adjustment of his expression, before he settled it into something neutral. "Miss Price," he said. "Them are Winters." She set the basket on the counter. "I have the syrup and the chamomile. The quality is the same as the last batch. If you want to check the seals. I know the quality." He took off his spectacles. He seemed to be deciding something. "I can't take them. I'm sorry." He stopped. I've had a request not to. From certain people. You understand that I understand. She did. She picked up the basket. She did not allow her hands to tighten on the handle, Miss Price. He said it before she had turned fully around. She stopped but did not turn back. I shouldn't say this. It isn't my boosie. Ness. He cleared his throat. There is a place you might try. Thornfield Hall. It's 3 miles out, past the old mill. The Duke of Thornfield. He paused again. People say things about him. You'll have heard the things they say. She had. She had heard them from the grocer, from the vicar's wife. From a woman at the market who had lowered her voice as though the name itself might carry. They said the Duke of Thornfield had killed a woman. Not with intention. Perhaps. With arrogance. With the particular recklessness of a man who believed his own education made him more capable than men who had practiced their whole lives. They said he had stood up at the County Medical Society and told the assembled physicians that they were wrong. That Lady Bellington's illness had been mismanaged, that the treatment was making her worse, not better. They said he had been, at the time, 20 and newly come into his title and possessed of some theoretical knowledge acquired in Edinburgh that he apparently mistook for competence. They said Lady Bellington had died 3 weeks later. They said the Duke had not spoken publicly since. I've heard, Evelyn said, they also say. Mr. Winters went on, looking at the counter rather than at her, that he takes in anyone who comes to Thornfield. Sick tenants. Poor families. People without recourse. He doesn't advertise it. He doesn't charge. Nobody knows quite how it works because nobody talks about it. But it works. He picked up his spectacles. He might take your stock. He might have use for someone who knows herbs properly. I don't know. He put his spectacles back on. I'm sorry I can't do more. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold at her back and the warm shop smell of camphor and LD wood around her, and she thought about Lady Bellington, who had been her mother. She thought about the 3 miles past the old mill. She thought about the 6 bottles of elderberry syrup that would turn in a month. Thank you, Mr. Winters, she said. And went out. Thornfield Hall was not what she had expected. She had built it in her mind over the 3 miles of frozen road as she walked, a closed and lightless place, the kind of house a silent man would make around himself. All shut windows and overgrown approaches and the general atmosphere of something that had given up on being looked at. She had prepared herself for cold and strangeness and the specific discomfort of being received, or not received, by a man about whom the primary thing anyone said was that he had been responsible for her mother's death. The house she came to in the failing afternoon light was long and low and built of the pale grey stone of this part of Kent. And it sat in its valley as though it had grown there rather than been constructed, unhurried and unassuming, with smoke going up straight from 4 chimneys into the still cold air and every ground floor window lit. It looked, in the last of the light, like a house that was used. There were tools stacked by an outbuilding in the way of a working farm, and a kitchen garden that had been properly put to bed for winter, and a yard swept clean that morning, she judged. From the way the frost had reformed in patterns around the swept edges, she had expected desolation. The absence of it unsettled her more than desolation would have. The door was answered by a woman of perhaps 60, broad and grey-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who has long practice at taking in information without appearing to. She looked at Evelyn on the step, and at the basket, and at the boots, and then back at Evelyn's face. Miss Price, Evelyn said. I was told Mr. Winters, in the village, suggested that. Come in out of the cold, the woman said. In Martha, the hall was warm. That was the first thing. Not the warmth of a fire recently lit for appearances, but the settled warmth of a house that had been heated consistently for months. Warmth that had worked itself into the walls and the floorboards and the curtains. Evelyn stood in it and felt something in her shoulders release that had been held for so long she had stopped noticing the holding. Martha took her basket without asking and led her up a back stair and into a room and the first floor that had a fire burning in the grate. A proper fire. It had been burning for some time, the stone surround was warm when Evelyn stepped close to it, and the coals were settled into a steady glow, not the sharp brightness of something just started. "Someone lit this," Evelyn said. Before she could decide whether to say it, "His Grace's orders," Martha said. She was setting the basket down on the table by the window and seemed to be occupied with straightening the contents. But something in her tone carried a weight she wasn't explaining. "He came himself this morning to check the flue. The guest rooms don't always draw well in November. He wanted to be certain." She paused. "He doesn't often come to the guest rooms." Evelyn looked at the fire. It had been burning for an hour. "You are at least." Someone had come to this room this morning to check the chimney and this afternoon to light the fire, and done both of these things for a woman he had never met, who might not have come at all. She thought of 17 closed doors. She thought of Mrs. Gill, who had opened her door wide enough to see and then opened it no wider. She thought of Mr. Pell, stationary in his usual chair. She did not know what to do with a fire that had been lit before she arrived. "Thank you," she said. "For lack of anything more adequate, he'll want to see your stock tomorrow, most likely," Martha said. "Not tonight. Tonight you'll eat and sleep and get warm. That's all." She moved to the door. Then stopped with her hand on the frame. "You'll find Thornfield is not what people say it is. Most things people say it is not. I've been here 20 years and I'd warrant that." She looked at Evelyn in the way of someone deciding how much to add. "And decided on one thing more. He's not easy. I won't tell you he's easy. But there's a difference between not easy and not good. And people in this county have spent 10 years confusing the two." That she went out. Evelyn stood in front of the fire and held out her hands to it and tried to think clearly. The room was clean and plainly furnished and smelled of beeswax and something faintly herbal she couldn't identify from where he stood. On the table beside her basket someone had left a small pitcher of water and a cup. Outside the window the last of the light was going out of the sky over the valley. She was still standing there, hands extended. When she heard the step in the corridor, it was barely a sound at all. She would not have noticed it if she had not been listening in the particular way of someone in a strange house, alert to every register of an unfamiliar place. A single footfall, very quiet. And then stillness. She turned. He was in the doorway. She had not heard him stop or arrive or intend to be there. He was simply there, as though the doorway had always contained him and she had only now looked at the right place. He was tall, dark-haired, with some gray in it that sat early. And a face that had been set, probably habitually, into an expression that gave away nothing at all. He was looking at her. She had been bracing since winter's shop for what this moment would be. She had prepared herself for something grasping, or cold, or contemptuous in the way of a man who knows exactly what he is owed and has a precise accounting of what she was not. She had prepared herself, more than anything, for guilt. For the specific quality of attention a man turns on someone he has wronged. Which is never quite a look at them and always something adjacent to it, something that refuses to settle. He was looking at her directly. His eyes were dark gray. And they held nothing she had prepared for. They held something she could not name immediately. She stood in front of his fire with her cold hands extended and looked for the things she had been certain would be there: some want, some calculation. Some trace of the arrogance they said had killed her mother, and found instead something she could only describe, later, when she had words for it, as a debt. Not owed to her particularly. Not directed. Only present. The way a weight is present in a room even when no one names it. She dropped her hands and drew herself up. "Your Grace." That he inclined his head. He did not speak. He looked at her for a moment longer in that complete, reading way. She had the strange sense he was cataloguing something, setting it down somewhere careful, and then he turned and walked away down the corridor. And was gone as quietly as he had arrived. She stood alone in the warm room and could not make it mean what she needed it to mean. She had come to Thornfield Hall because she had no other door left. She had expected to find, behind it, the thing that was always behind the last door: the price. The catch, the particular form of ruin reserved for women who had run out of choices. The fire burned steadily in the grate. she had no name yet for what she had found instead. She found the herb room on her second morning. It was at the back of the house, north-facing, with 3 long windows that let in the kind of flat gray light that did not flatter anything but was honest about everything. Someone had built the shelving with a working knowledge of how herbs were actually used. The drying racks were positioned for airflow, not aesthetics. And the labeling system, though in a hand she did not recognize, was precise in a way that most apothecaries were not. It distinguished between preparations made for internal use and those for topical application. It noted harvest dates. It flagged where a substitute had been used and why. She stood in the middle of the room and felt something settle in her chest that had not settled in 2 years. Martha had told her, the evening before, that she was welcome to use it. She had not said by whose permission or under what terms. Evelyn had not asked. She had learned that questions of that kind, asked too soon, had a way of reminding people that they had not yet decided whether to answer them. She spent the morning taking inventory. Her own stock from the basket had been placed on the central table, and she arranged it alongside what was already there. Making notes in the small book she carried everywhere, cross-referencing where her preparations overlapped with the room's existing supply and where they filled gaps. It was absorbing work. She forgot, for stretches of half an hour at a time, where she was and how she had come to be there. And those stretches were the closest she had come to rest in longer than she wanted to calculate. She had left her working notes open on the table, the notebook where she kept her running observations about preparations that were not quite right, formulations she was trying to correct, questions she had not yet answered. It was not a document she would have shown anyone deliberately. It was the record of her uncertainty, which was also the record of her thinking. And she had been alone long enough that she had stopped being careful about it. She went out after midday to walk the grounds. Martha had said she might. Had said it with the particular emphasis of someone conveying permission from another source, and when she came back to the herb room in the early afternoon her notebook was where she had left it. That it was not entirely as she had left it. On the page she had been working on, beside a note she had written in the margin, valerian preparation, standard ratio, but something still not right in application, patient's report, persistent nausea. There was new writing. A different hand, compact and very precise. In ink that was not quite dry when she touched the edge of the page. The ratio is not the issue. The preparation method is. Simmering destroys the volatile compounds responsible for the therapeutic effect and leaves predominantly the constituents that cause gastric irritation. Infuse cold. Minimum 4 hours. Nausea should resolve. Below that, a single letter, T. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She had been working with valerian preparations for 8 months. She had adjusted the ratio 4 times. She had consulted the 2 books on herbal medicine she owned, both of which gave the same simmering method, both of which she now understood were wrong. 8 months of patients reporting nausea, and she had been making the problem worse with every correction she tried. Because she had been correcting the wrong thing, she stood with the notebook in her hands and thought about who had written this. She thought about the room's labeling system, which distinguished things most people did not think to distinguish. She thought about the hand, which was not the hand of someone writing down received knowledge but the hand of someone writing down something they had worked out themselves. With the particular compression of a person who has thought through something completely and has no need to explain how they got there. Then she thought about what they said in the village about the Duke of Thornfield, who had stood up in a room full of trained physicians and told them they were managing her mother's case incorrectly. She had dismissed that, when she heard it, as the recklessness of an arrogant young man playing at medicine. She had needed it to be that. Because the alternative, that he had been right and had been destroyed for it, was a thing she had not been ready to hold. She sat down at the table and looked at the annotation for a long time. Infuse cold, minimum 4 hours, she wrote, in her own hand, directly below the initial T. Thank you. I'll try it. She did not sign it. She thought that was sufficient. She left the notebook open on the table and went to start over with the valerian. 3 weeks into her time at Thornfield, Evelyn walked to the village on an errand for Martha. Delivery of prepared tinctures to 2 families that Martha had been supplying for years, widows mostly, people who could not easily make the trip themselves, and on the way back she stopped at the edge of Parrish's lower field. Because a man was sitting on the stile with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone who has recently been surprised into feeling something and has not yet put it away. His name was Corby. She learned that afterward. He was perhaps 65. Weathered in the way of a man who has worked outside his whole life, and he had the Kent farmer's habit of speaking to strangers with the assumption that they already knew the local geography and half the local history. "You're from up at Thornfield?" he said. It was not a question. She had learned that people in the valley recognized the direction she came from, which was a direction that had its own associations. She said that he looked at his hat. He turned it over in his hands. "My girl was sick," he said. "Last winter. Fever. The physician in the village said there wasn't much to be done and sent me home with something that didn't do anything." He paused. "Someone came in the night. I don't know how they knew to come. Nobody ID sent for. They left a written preparation precise, to the letter. Every step, what to use and how much and at what intervals." He looked up at her. "She got better." "Evelyn waited. I saw him once," Corby said. "The one who came. It was dark, and he didn't come inside. He left the paper in the door. But there's only one man in this valley that tall." He turned his hat over again. "I went up to the hall to thank him. 6 months ago. The housekeeper said he wasn't receiving. I've tried twice more since. Same answer." He said this without bitterness. "Only as a fact. I asked around. Seems there are others. Jameson's boy with the lung trouble, the Whitmore woman after her confinement, old Pierce down past the mill, all of them with the same story. Someone came. Someone left instructions. Nobody knows who. Except they do know and they don't say it out loud." He settled his hat back on his head. "I put him in my prayers. No name. Just the one I mean. I reckon God knows." Evelyn looked out across Parrish's field, which was brown and frost-hardened under the November sky. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Not unkindly. Corby shrugged, a slow, considered movement. "You're from the Hull. You'll see him when I can't." He looked at her steadily. "If you get the chance. Tell him Corby's girl is well. That's all. He doesn't need to say anything back. I don't need him to. I just thought he stopped. A man ought to know when he's done something that matter. Edition. Even if he won't let you tell him to his face. He ought to know somehow." Evelyn walked back to Thornfield with Corby's words sitting in her chest where the cold usually was, and they were warmer than the cold, and heavier. She had been trying, since she arrived, to construct an accounting of the Duke of Thornfield. It was a habit born of 2 years of necessary caution, the habit of understanding exactly what a person wanted and what they were capable of before allowing herself to need anything from them. She had built up a careful ledger, on one side, the things that frightened her or that she did not understand. On the other side, the things that were simply, plainly, undeniably real, the fire that had been burning in her room before she arrived. The annotation in the margin of her notebook. The labeling system in the herb room that someone had built with 20 years of working knowledge. The way Martha spoke of him. Which was not the way a housekeeper spoke of an employer she managed, but the way a person spoke of someone they had watched be ground down by something and had not been able to stop. And now Corby, sitting on a stile in the cold because he had run out of ways to say thank you to a man who would not be thanked. She thought about what that was. Not modesty, Martha had said once, in passing, with the careful tone of someone correcting a misapprehension before it could settle. Not modesty. Something harder, she thought. A man who has stopped believing his thanks are worth having, she thought. A man who has come to trust only the things that do not require him to speak. She did not yet know why. But she was beginning to understand that the why existed, and that it was not a small thing. And that the stories the village told about the Duke of Thornfield were the stories people tell about a wound when they cannot see the wound itself, inaccurate, and reaching. And built entirely around the shape of the absence. She came back to Thornfield in the early dark and went directly to the herb room, and found that the fire there had been banked against the cold while she was out, without her asking. By someone who had known she would come back to it before supper. She stood with her hands over the warmth of it and added that to the ledger. The side that frightened her was getting shorter. She was not meant to be awake at that hour. She had gone to bed at 10 and found she could not stay irresolute in the quality of the silence at Thornfield was different from the silence she had grown used to in the rented room in Ashwick, fuller somehow, more populated with small sounds. And she had not yet learned to sleep through it. She was lying in the dark listening to the wind come across the valley when she heard the knocking that it was not at the front of the house. It came from below and to the left, from the direction of the yard. 3 knocks and then a pause and then 3 more. The rhythm of someone making enough noise to be heard without quite making enough to seem desperate. She was at the window before she had decided to move. The yard below was grey with moonlight. A man she did not know stood at the gate with a lantern that he was holding low. The way you held a light when you did not want to illuminate your own face. He was talking to someone she could not yet see, and then she could see, because he stepped into the lantern light, the Duke, already coated. Already carrying his bag. She had not heard him come down. She had been listening to the house. She pulled on her clothes in the dark without lighting her candle. She could not have said why. Except that there was something about the deliberateness of what was happening below that made her reluctant to disturb it with something as loud as a struck match, and she went down the back stairs and through the kitchen and out the yard door. And the man with the lantern looked at her and then at the Duke, and the Duke looked at her for a moment and then turned and started walking. She took that for permission and followed. The Manha said his name was Fletcher, Evelyn gathered from fragments. A tenant from the far edge of the Thornfield land walked ahead with the lantern and talked in the low continuous way of someone managing panic by converting it into information. His boy. High fever since yesterday. The physician in the village had come that afternoon and left something that had not helped and said he would return in the morning if the boy was no better, which Fletcher had understood to mean that the physician did not expect much to be different in the morning. The Duke walked without responding. Not dismissively, was listening. Evelyn could see that from the way his head was positioned, the angle of attention, but as though he had already sorted what he was hearing into what was useful and what was not, and was reserving his effort for the part that would require it. The cottage was small and overwarm. The way a sick child's room becomes when everyone who loves the child is afraid, and warmth is the only thing they know how to provide. The boy was perhaps 7, dark-haired, very still in a way that was not the stillness of sleep. His mother was by the bed with a cloth she was re-wetting in a bowl. And she looked up when they came in with the expression of someone who has been holding themselves together for a long time by concentrating on a task and is now afraid to stop. The Duke set down his bag. He did not speak. He moved to the bed and put his hand to the boy's forehead and held it there. Not briefly, long enough to mean something, and then he did the systematic work of assessment: pulse, breathing, the color of the gums, the whites of the eyes, with the efficient focus of a man who has done this enough times that he no longer needs to narrate it. Not even to himself. Evelyn stayed near the door. She watched him. There was a quality to his attention that she recognized from the herb room, from the way he moved among the preparations and the way the annotations read on the page. But she had not seen it in his body before. It was total. The rest of the room, the anxious parents, the low fire, her own presence seemed to exist in a different register from the space he occupied, which contained only him and the child and whatever he was reading from the child's body, in the way you read a text you know well enough to trust that he opened his bag and worked for a while with things she could not see clearly from the door. He wrote something down and gave the paper to the mother. And then he did something she had not expected, that he took the boy's hand, not to examine it. He had finished examining. He held it the way you hold someone's hand when they are frightened and you want them to know that you are there, his thumb resting across the back of the small cold hand. And he sat with it for a long time without moving, without speaking, while the boy's breathing slowly changed register, losing some of the tightness she could hear from across the room. Fletcher's wife began to cry, silently. The way women cried when they had been holding back for a long time and something had finally told them they were allowed. The Duke did not acknowledge it. He went on holding the child's hand. When he finally stood, the boy was asleep, real sleep. The change in breathing unmistakable, and the Duke gave the mother a second paper, this one with what Evelyn recognized from a glance as dosing instructions and schedule, and he picked up his bag and turned for the door. Fletcher caught his arm. He was saying something "thank you" was in it. And the boy's name, and something about not knowing what they would have done, and the Duke stopped moving. He stood while Fletcher spoke. He did not pull away, but something happened in his face that Evelyn, standing 3 feet away, was close enough to see that it was not impatience. It was not coldness, that it was the expression of a man who has been thanked in a language he has forgotten how to receive. Not indifference, the opposite of indifference. He heard it. It registered. And he did not know, she saw quite clearly, what you were supposed to do with it, where to put it, how to carry it back out into the night. That he inclined his head to Fletcher and stepped past him into the yard. Evelyn followed. They walked back through the dark without speaking. The lantern had stayed with Fletcher and they were navigating by moonlight, which was sufficient. The Duke's stride was long but unhurried, and she matched it without effort, and after a while she said, not asking anything, not expecting a response, only because it was true and she was tired enough that the ordinary cautions had relaxed. "You saved him tonight." The Duke did not stop walking. He did not respond, but for a fraction of a second, between one step and the next, his pace changed. A hesitation so brief she would not have caught it if she had not been watching the ground. As though the words had reached him and he had not been prepared for them to. And the preparation he had been doing without the preparation of being heard had taken a moment of adjustment from the rest of him, that he did not turn. He walked on, she walked beside him the rest of the way back in silence. And she thought about the look on his face when Fletcher thanked him, that unguarded, undefended confusion, and she understood something she had not understood before. Not what had happened to him. Not yet. Only that something had, and that it was old enough to have become structural. The way a break in a bone becomes structural if it heals wrong and you build everything afterward around it. They reached the yard. He went in through the kitchen door. She stood for a moment in the cold outside it, looking up at a sky full of stars that did not care about any of this. Then she went in too. She did not sleep for a long time after. She had not planned for the mornings to become theirs. That it happened the way most things at Thornfield happened, without announcement or negotiation. Simply by repetition, settling into habit. She rose early because she had always risen early. Because the dawn was the best light for the close work of preparation, and because there was a quality to the first hour of the day that she had learned to protect. She went to the herb room. She worked till he came in at some point after she arrived, half an hour, sometimes more. Nevertheless, Anne went to the far end of the room where the larger table was, where he kept papers she had learned not to look at too directly, estate documents mostly, and correspondence he dealt with in that compressed and economical hand that she had come to recognize on sight. He did not announce himself. He did not speak. He sat, and the room contained 2 people instead of 1. And the work continued. That it should have been uncomfortable. She had shared workrooms with people before, in the years before Ashwick, and it was always uncomfortable. The adjustment of presence, the heightened awareness of your own sounds. The performance of not being watched. This was not that. She could not fully account for it. She thought it had something to do with the quality of his silence. Which was not the silence of a person withholding something, but the silence of a person who was simply and completely occupied with what was in front of them. It made no demands on her. It left her precisely as alone as she needed to be while not being, in fact, alone. A week into this arrangement, she was working through the properties of a compound preparation she had been modifying for 3 months, and she wrote a note to herself in the margin of her working book without thinking. Still convinced the standard preparation has a systemic error, not one compound but the principle of combination. Has anyone tested interval dosing versus concurrent? She wrote it the way she always wrote such notes, in the shorthand of someone talking to themselves. And she left the book open and went to check on a long steep she had set the night before. When she came back, there was a new annotation: interval dosing tested 1811, Harwich Dispensary Records, unpublished. Result: 34 improvement in absorption. The principle of combination is the error. You are right. Below it, and then, in what seemed like a second edition, the ink marginally lighter as though the pen had been redipped. I have suspected this for 3 years. I believed I was the only one that she read it twice. She read the last line a third time. She took up her pen and wrote, below his. You were not the only one. You were only the one without the Harwich records. She did not sign it. She went back to her steep. From the far end of the room there was, after a while, a sound. She identified it after a moment. The sound of a pen being set down on a table. Deliberately. With something that in another context, from another person, she might have called satisfaction. She did not look up. But she found, without meaning to, that she was smiling at her jars. That was the morning she kept the page. She had been keeping the annotated pages all along, folding them and setting them in the small drawer of the herb room table. She had told herself it was professional practice. A record of useful corrections. She told herself that again now. She found, sitting in the quiet room with his silence a steady presence at the other end of it, that she believed herself slightly less than she had before. The pages accumulated. She was honest enough with herself. By the end of the second week of mornings, to admit that she had stopped pretending the collection was professional record-keeping. A professional record would have stayed in the herb room, filed with the preparation notes where it belonged. Instead the folded pages were in her room. In the small drawer of the dressing table, which was where she kept the things that were hers. She had not examined what that meant. She was practiced at not examining things until she was ready for what the examination would find. But she was aware. In the way you are aware of a change in the weather before you can name what the change is, that something in the quality of her days at Thornfield had shifted. She had come here with nothing and had expected to receive nothing that mattered. She had expected transactions. Her knowledge for his resources, her labor for her room and board, the careful exchange of a woman who has learned that every apparent gift has a price attached at some point downstream. She had not expected to feel. Sitting in a room with a silent man who communicated in the margins of her notebooks, that she was being known. Not managed, not assessed for usefulness, not tolerated, known. She did not know what to do with that. She put it in the drawer with the pages and left it there. And went down to breakfast, and told herself she would examine it later. Later had not yet arrived. Martha's fever came on a Tuesday. It came the way fevers came in the old, with a swiftness that left no room for doubt about its seriousness. By evening she was in her bed, and by midnight Evelyn, who had taken up the watch without being asked because there was no one else in the house equipped to, and because Martha had been the first person in 2 years to open a door to her without calculation, was sitting in the chair beside the bed re-wetting the cloth and watching the old woman's face move through the small urgent landscape of a fever dream. The Duke had been sent for. He came, examined her, left instructions with a quietness that told Evelyn this was not the first time he had sat with a serious illness under this roof, and withdrew to his study. He would come back. She understood. This was not abandonment but the management of a long night. She sat with Martha alone. The fever peaked somewhere past 2 in the morning. Martha's breathing changed, becoming rapid and irregular, and Evelyn worked with the preparations the Duke had left a measured thing. And she measured it precisely, grateful now for 8 months of discipline, and she talked to Martha in a low continuous voice the way she had learned to talk to patients, not expecting to be heard. Only offering the sound of another person as an anchor. Martha talked back, not to Evelyn. To someone in the dream. The words were fragmented at first, the ordinary detritus of a long life surfacing under pressure. Names Evelyn did not know, places. Instructions about linens, and then they became coherent in the way of people who dream about the thing they have been carrying, because the carrying becomes heaviest when the ordinary controls are down. She said, Lady Bellington. Evelyn went still. Martha said. He was right. He wrote it down. I saw the paper before. Vane. She stopped. She turned her head against the pillow. He was right, and they took the paper, and he stood up and told them, and they laughed at him, and I couldn't. Her hands moved under the coverlet. 22 years old, and he stood up in front of all of them and told them the truth, and they used it against him, and I couldn't tell anyone because who would listen to a housekeeper? Evelyn set down the cloth. She sat very still in the chair beside the bed, and she did not move for a long time. Martha's voice went on, following the dream through its architecture, and Evelyn listened to all of it. She listened to the account of a woman who had been Lady Bellington's nurse in those last weeks and had seen the Duke of Thornfield, young and absolute in his certainty, sit at the bedside and understand something the attending physicians had not understood. She listened to the name Sir Gerald Vane, spoken with a flatness that was worse than any inflection. The flatness of a judgment delivered and never revised. She listened to Martha describe the document, the original assessment, in the Duke's hand, and then the conversation she had not been meant to overhear, through a door that had not been fully closed. And then the document that had been different afterward, and the Duke who had gone to the medical society anyway, without the paper, with only his word. She listened to the account of what the medical society had done with his word. They laughed, Martha said again. In the dream. He was 20 and he told them the truth and they laughed, and then they used his speaking to say that Bellington had no one but a green boy to defend him, or they used it. Evelyn looked at the wall above the bed. She thought about the herb room labeling system, which knew things the standard texts did not. She thought about the dosing instructions the Duke had written out for Fletcher's boy, which were not the standard instructions. She thought about the cold infusion of valerian, and the Harwich records. And 8 words in a margin that had resolved 8 months of failure. She thought about the thing she had believed for 2 years, that her mother had died because a reckless young Duke had played at medicine and been wrong, that he had not been wrong. The thought arrived without drama. The way true things arrived when you had been circling them long enough, not as a surprise but as the thing you had been about to say before you caught yourself, now finally said. He had not been wrong. He had been right, and someone had made it impossible for his being right to matter. And then they had used his attempt to make it matter as another instrument against him. And he had been 22 years old and he had watched the truth he had told cause more damage than silence would have done. She sat with that for a long time. The fever broke a little before dawn. Martha's breathing slowed and steadied, and the terrible efficiency of the dream loosened its grip. And she slept real sleep, exhausted and quiet. Evelyn sat beside her and did not move. She heard the door. The Duke came in quietly and looked at Martha and then at Evelyn. And whatever he saw in Evelyn's face made him pause. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the still grey light coming in behind him. She thought, he doesn't know that I know. She looked at him, the early grey in his hair, the set of his face. The way he stood, with the particular quality of a person who has learned to make themselves take up less space. Not from timidity but from a long practice of not imposing. And she thought about 22 years old. She thought about standing up in a room full of authority and saying the true thing and watching it destroy the person you were trying to save. She understood now why he did not speak, not the FAC. Tivich had known the fact of it for weeks, but the shape of it, the interior logic. A man who had spoken once with his whole self and watched the speaking make things worse did not become silent because he had nothing to say. He became silent because he had learned. At a cost she was only now beginning to measure. That his saying it was the problem. That his voice was the variable that made the truth dangerous, that he had removed the variable. The Duke crossed to the other side of the bed and checked Martha's pulse and her temperature with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. And then he straightened and looked at Evelyn, and she saw the question he was not asking. How long have you been awake? And are you well enough? He could not ask it. She was beginning to understand that he could not ask it, not because he did not want to but because he had stopped trusting the instrument he would have needed to ask it with. She answered it anyway. She broke around an hour ago. She's stable. All are. That he nodded. He did not go. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it on his side of the bed and sat down. They kept the watch together in the grey early morning, the two of them on either side of Martha's sleeping form, and the room was very quiet, and the fire burned low. And at some point the light outside the window changed from grey to the particular pale gold of a winter dawn. Evelyn looked across the bed and found him looking at her, not at Martha. At her. There was nothing guarded in it. That was what stopped her, the absence of the guard. The thing that was usually between him and any direct looking. The wound was there, everything Martha had named and she had now seen the shape of. And underneath it something that had nothing to do with debt or history or the long wait of a truth told badly once. She did not look away. Neither did he. Martha stirred and murmured something indistinct, and the moment folded quietly back into the morning. And the Duke looked down at his aunt's face and Evelyn looked at her hands, and neither of them spoke, but it had happened. They had both been there when it happened, and she could not now unknow what she had seen, and she thought he could not either. And she thought that they would both spend some time pretending otherwise, because they were people who had learned caution the expensive way, and caution was what they had. She went to her room when Martha was settled, in the full morning, and sat on the edge of the bed. She knew, now, why the fire had been lit before she arrived. She knew why the herb room existed and who had built it and with whose knowledge. She knew the shape of the debt he believed he owed not to her, but to the woman who had died in a bed in this county while a 22-year-old duke watched his own testimony be turned into a weapon. She knew, too, and this was the part that required sitting with, that everything he had done for her, the fire, the annotations, the cold morning silences, the herb room with its careful labeling had not been done for her. It had been done for a dead woman. A debt paid in installments to a grave. She sat with that for a long time. It was not, she found, as simple as it should have been. It should have been clarifying. The kind of knowledge that resolved a thing. Instead it was the kind of knowledge that made everything more complicated, because she had been at Thornfield for 6 weeks now and she had made the mistake, somewhere in those 6 weeks, of beginning to need it, not the roof and the fire and the professional resource of the herb room. Those she could have needed without danger. She had made the mistake of beginning to need the mornings. She did not go to the herb room the next morning. She told herself it was because she was read from the night watch, which was true. She stayed in her room until late morning, and when she finally came downstairs she went to the kitchen and helped Martha, who was recovered enough to be furious about being recovered slowly, sort dried herbs at the kitchen table. And she did not go near the far end of the house where the herb room was. She did not go the morning after that, either. On the third morning she sat in her room in the early dark and was honest with herself in the way she had trained herself to be honest. Because dishonesty was a luxury and she had not been able to afford luxuries for 2 years, she had 2 choices. She could leave. She could go to Martha and say that she had been grateful for the position but that her circumstances had changed. And she could take what she had earned and go to the next county and build something there, in a place where no one knew the Bellington name or the Thornfield name or the particular shape of the story that connected them. The case for leaving was clean. She was a woman alone, without family or position, living in a house that belonged to a man who had been keeping her out of guilt for a dead woman. The kindness was real but its foundation was a debt. And she had spent 2 years learning what it cost to build on other people's debts. The case for leaving had the straightforward force of all arguments made from self-preservation. She sat with it for a long time, then she thought about the annotation. I believed I was the only one. She thought about Fletcher's yard, and the step that had changed its rhythm for half a second before he walked on. She thought about a man of 22 standing up in a room full of authority and saying the true thing. And the thing that had happened to him afterward, and the 10 years of silence that had followed, and the specific quality of that silence. Not empty, she knew that now, nothing like empty, but a silence that had been built around a wound the way scar tissue was built around a break. Functional and permanent and not the same as healed, she thought. He has stopped believing his voice is worth anything. He has been alone in that belief for 10 years. And she thought, with a precision that surprised her with its steadiness, I am perhaps the only person in this county who now knows enough to tell him he is wrong, not because of the feeling she had been not examining for weeks. Because of the valerian preparation and the Harwich records and the cold infusion that had worked on the first attempt. Because she was the only person at Thornfield, apart from Martha, who understood both what he knew and what had been done to him for knowing it. That was a specific thing. That was not sentiment. That was a capacity she had that no one else in his immediate world possessed. If she left, she took that with her. She did not flatter herself that he could not survive her leaving. He had been surviving for 10 years and would continue. But she thought about what Corby had said, sitting on a stile in a cold field with his hat in his hands. A man ought to know when he's done something that mattered, she thought, and a man ought to know when the thing he believes about himself is wrong. She got up. She dressed. She went downstairs and along the corridor and into the herb room. And she set her notebook open on the table at the page she was working on, and she put the small fire on to heat. And she sat down. Half an hour later she heard the quiet step in the corridor. The door opened. She did not look up from her work that he came in and went to his end of the table and set down his papers. The room settled into its accustomed register. Two people and their separate tasks and the shared warmth of the fire. And Evelyn looked at the preparation in front of her and felt something in her chest that was not quite resolution and not quite relief and was perhaps only the particular steadiness of a person who has made a decision they intend to keep. She stayed, the mornings resumed, she noticed. In the days that followed. That something in the quality of the herb room's silence had changed. Not in any way she could have pointed to if someone had asked her to describe it. The fire burned the same. The light came in the same way through the north windows. He arrived at the same interval after she did and sat at the same end of the table and worked at the same papers, but she was aware of him now in a way that was different from the awareness of a person sharing a room with an unknown quantity. That was over. She knew what she was sharing the room with. She knew the shape of what had happened to him and why the was silent and what the silence had cost. And that knowledge had changed the register of everything, the way knowing the name of a piece of music changed how you heard it, not different notes, but differently weighted, differently arrived at. She kept working. She did not treat him differently. Or not in any way she allowed to show. She had decided, in the cold honesty of her room at 4 in the morning, that the thing she could give him was not sympathy, would not want sympathy. She was certain of that, but the specific practical thing of continuing to be a person who found his knowledge worth engaging with. A person to whom his words, when he chose to write them, were not a curiosity or a performance but simply the useful and often surprising output of a mind she had come to respect. She could give him that. It was a real thing. It was the kind of thing he trusted. She opened her notebook. She wrote the next question at the top of a fresh page and left it where he would see it when he arrived. She was, she thought, learning his language. It had taken her a while to recognize it as a language, with its own grammar and its own register of intimacy. But it was. Old John did not ask to come to Thornfield. He was carried there on a door by 2 of his sons, in the first week of December. Because he had asked to die somewhere warm and the cottage had let the cold in through the walls for 30 years and was not going to stop now that he was a tenant. He had worked the same parcel of Thornfield land for 40 years. He was 81. And he had the particular composure of very old men who have finished being afraid of the thing that is coming and are now only managing the logistics of it. Martha gave him the room at the end of the east corridor. It was a small room, but it had a good fireplace and a window that looked out over the valley, and John said, when they settled him in, that it was a finer prospect than Head had a right to expect, which was the closest he came to thanks. Evelyn sat with him in the afternoons, when his sons had gone back to their families and Martha was occupied with the house. It was not a medical watch, there was nothing medical to be done, the Duke had been clear about that. Writing it out for her in the careful way he wrote things that mattered, but the company of a person who was not frightened was useful, and she found she was not frightened. She had sat with enough dying in the past 2 years to have lost the particular terror of it. Though not the weight. John talked when he felt like it and was silent when he didn't, and she found his company restful in the way of people who have stopped performing anything. On the 3rd night, she was there past midnight. John had been restless earlier and had settled only an hour before. And she had stayed because leaving felt premature. She was reading by the low lamp when she heard the door. She knew the step by now. The Duke came in without knocking. She had understood some time ago that the house operated on a different protocol of permission than other houses. That doors were not barriers here but information, open meaning come in and closed meaning not yet. And he looked at John and then at her and did not speak. He drew the chair from the corner, the same way he had drawn the chair in Martha's room, and placed it on the other side of the bed. And Saturday they sat on either side of old John, who was sleeping with his hands folded on the coverlet in an attitude that was almost deliberate. As though he had arranged himself. The fire was low. The window showed nothing but darkness and the faint reflection of the lamp. The house was entirely quiet at this hour. The deep quiet of a place that had been warm and lived in for centuries and had absorbed all that living into its walls. She was not looking at him. She was looking at John's hands, at the way the lamplight moved across the knuckles, at the slow rise and fall of the old man's breathing, which was shallow now but steady. and then it was not steady that it changed in the way she had learned to recognize, a lengthening of the interval between breaths, a slight change in the quality of the sound. She looked up. The Duke was already looking at John with the focused attention she knew. And she saw him register the same change she had registered, and she saw him set his hands flat on his knees, a small deliberate movement. And she understood that he was not going to try to stop it and had known for some time that he was not going to try to stop it. They waited together, John's breathing lengthened once more, and then there was a breath that was different from the others, fuller somehow and slower. And then there was not another one that the Duke reached across and closed the old man's eyes. His hand was steady. He held it there for a moment, the way you held a door closed until you were certain it had caught. And then he withdrew it and sat back. That he stood after a while and went to the window. She watched him. He was standing with his back to the room, both hands at his sides, looking out at the dark valley. The lamp threw his shadow long across the floor. She had sat through deaths before. And she knew the particular quality of the silence that followed one, the way it was different from other silences, more complete, more demanding of something from the people left in the room. Some people filled it with words. Some people left. Some people prayed. She stood up, she was not certain. Afterward, that she had decided to do it. She thought it was more that the decision had already been made somewhere below the level of deliberation, and she was only discovering it as she did it. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and looked out at what he was looking at. Which was the dark valley and the shapes of the hills against the sky and the single light in a farmhouse window far below. That he did not move when she came to stand beside him. He did not step away or turn or in any way indicate that her presence had changed something he wished to keep unchanged. He went on looking at the window, she went on looking at the window. The valley was very still. The farmhouse light was a steady yellow point in the dark, and she thought about whoever was awake in that farmhouse at this hour, tending something, a child, an animal. A fire, and she felt the weight of the room behind them and the specific ache of a life that had been long and was now finished, and beside her the Duke of Thornfield stood in silence, and she thought that he was feeling it too, or something adjacent to it. And that this was perhaps the first time in a very long time that he had felt something in the same room as another person who knew he was feeling it. She did not touch him. She did not speak, she was simply there, at the window, beside him. He was, she thought, the loneliest person she had ever stood next to. Not lonely in the way of a person who lacked company. The house was full of people who cared about him. In the careful devoted way of people who had watched someone be hurt and had made the care quiet so as not to make the hurt worse. Lonely in the way of a person who had been unreachable for so long that the habit of being unreachable had become indistinguishable from the self, she thought. I am standing next to that, she thought, and he has not moved away. They stood at the window for a long time. The farmhouse light went out. The valley was entirely dark. At some point he turned from the window. She turned at the same time, without planning to. And they were briefly facing each other in the low lamplight, and she saw his face clearly for a moment, not guarded, not arranged. Only tired and present and looking at her without the usual distance before he glanced away and toward the door. He went out quietly. She heard his steps recede down the corridor. She stood alone in the room with old John's still form and the dying fire and the dark window. And she put her hand flat on the cool glass, and she thought, something happened just now. She was not certain what to do with it. But she thought, with a precision she had not expected, that she did not want to do nothing. The word came to Thornfield the way bad words always came to Thornfield. From the village, slowly, and by the time it arrived it had already been everywhere else. Martha told her. She did it in the kitchen, in the morning, with the directness of someone who had decided that knowing was better than not knowing, and she told her plainly and without softening it. Which was the kindest way to tell a thing of that kind. Lady Harriet Vane had been talking. Evelyn sat with her tea and listened and kept her face still, which she was practiced at. The content of the talking was not, in its structure, unfamiliar. A young woman, unmarried. Living under the roof of an unmarried duke. Without family to account for her presence or position to explain if this was a thing that required only to be mentioned in the right voice to do considerable damage without any single element of it being technically false. Lady Vane had the right voice. She had been refining it for 30 years. And it was a marvel of its kind, gracious, regretful, weighted with the sorrow of a woman who would never dream of speaking ill of anyone but found herself obligated, out of simple concern, to note that it was such a pity, Lady Vane had apparently said. In several drawing rooms and at one very well-attended card evening, that the Price girl whatever one thought of the Bellington business, and she had always tried to think charitably should have found herself in quite such an irregular situation. That the Duke of Thornfield, of all people, should have and here the voice would do the work, the pause, the slight adjustment of the brow, the meaning that was all the worse for never being stated. How long has this been circulating? Evelyn asked. 3 weeks, I think. Before it reached me. You know how it goes. Martha refilled her own cup with the deliberateness of a person managing their hands. I wouldn't have told you except that I was in the village yesterday and Mrs. Farrell, who is a decent woman and an old friend, took me aside. She was warning me. Not gossiping. She said it had reached the point where people were choosing not to be seen speaking to anyone from this house. Evelyn put down her cup. Anyone, she said, me included. Martha said it without self-pity. Which was its own kind of statement. Evelyn looked at the window. Outside the December light was flat and white, the sky the color of old pewter. She thought about Martha, who had spent 20 years building a position in this county, a reputation for good sense and quiet reliability. The kind of reputation that took decades to accumulate and could be damaged in a season. She thought about the Duke, whose name was already what it was in this county. Who had spent 10 years operating in silence precisely because he had learned that his public presence made things worse rather than better, and who was now going to find his silence used against him again. This time not as evidence of arrogance but as evidence of something seamier and more entertaining. She thought about Lady Harriet Vane, Sir Gerald's widow. She thought about what Lady Vane stood to lose if the story of the Bellington case were ever properly examined, she thought. Of course, the precision of it was, in its way, almost admirable. Lady Vane did not need to attack the Duke directly. She did not need to revive the medical society case or defend her dead husband's reputation. She only needed to make Evelyn toxic enough that removing her became the obvious solution, and in removing her, Barry, the only person currently living under this roof who knew enough about the Bellington case to understand what had actually happened, that it was elegant. It was the kind of move that left no fingerprints and required no courage. Evelyn said, "Does he know?" Martha looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing an assumption. "He knows what I've told him, which is what I've just told you." "He has not." She paused. "He has not indicated what he intends to do about it. He does not discuss his intentions. No. Evelyn said. "He wouldn't." She sat for a while longer with the cooling tea. She thought about the drawing rooms that had shaped this county's understanding of itself, the rooms that had laughed at a 22-year-old Duke for telling the truth and had then spent a decade congratulating themselves on their good judgment. She thought about how those rooms had operated on Ashwick, the Holloway's cook, who had opened the door wide enough to see and then not wider. Mr. Pell, stationary behind his window. The 15 other closed doors. Each one making the next one easier to close. She had walked away from those doors. She had counted to 3 on each cold step and picked up her basket and moved on, because moving on was the only available option, and she had become very good at it. She was not certain. Sitting in Thornfield's warm kitchen with Martha's worried face across the table, that moving on was still the only available option. She was not certain, either, that she was the one who needed to decide that I need to speak to him. She said. Martha looked at her. Something in the look suggested that this conclusion was not entirely unexpected. "The study," she said. "He'll be there now." Evelyn stood up and straightened her dress and went down the corridor toward the study, whose door was, as it always was in the mornings, standing open. She had thought, walking down the corridor, that she was ready for it. She had been turned away from doors before. She knew the specific weight of it, the way a closed door communicated something beyond its physical fact. The information it carried about how much you counted and in what register. She had stood on 17 cold steps in November and learned to count to 3 and carry her basket and move on, and she had believed that the learning had been thorough. That she had arrived at a kind of immunity. She had not accounted for what it would feel like when the door was closed on someone else on her account. Martha had said it without inflection included, and those two words were still in Evelyn's chest as she walked. Sitting there with a weight that had nothing to do with self-pity and everything to do with the arithmetic of it, a woman of 60 who had built her reputation over 20 years, a woman who had opened a door to a stranger in November without asking for reasons. Standing in the village street while an old friend chose not to be seen speaking to her, because of Evelyn, because of a story told by a dead man's wife in a gracious voice with a regretful pause, she stopped in the corridor outside the study and stood with her hand not yet on the doorframe and Ade herself be precise about what she was walking in to say. She had learned, in 2 years of necessary pragmatism, that the moments when you most wanted to speak from feeling were the moments that most required you to speak from clarity instead. Feeling could come after. It had to. She stepped into the doorway. The study was as it always was in the mornings, the fire built up properly. The desk spread with papers, the Duke's dark head bent over whatever he was working at. The door had been open. It was always open that he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Something crossed his face, the quickening she had learned to recognize. The thing he could not quite suppress when she came into a room, and then the stillness returned, but she knew now to look underneath it. She came in and stood in the middle of the room and did not sit down. Because sitting down would have made this a different kind of conversation, and she needed it to be the kind it was. You know about Lady Vane, she said. That he looked at her. Martha told me this morning. But you knew before that. It was not a question. She had spent enough time in this house to understand how it worked. What reached him and how. She's been talking for 3 weeks. You know what she's saying. She paused. And you know why that he was very still. The pen was in his hand, but he had stopped writing. Martha was turned away by an old friend in the village yesterday. Evelyn said. Because of me. Because of what Lady Vane is saying about my being here, about what it means. About she stopped herself. Precision. She is going to keep saying it. It will not stop on its own. And the longer I remain at Thornfield the more it will cost everyone in this house. She looked at him directly. You know this, that he picked up the pen. She watched him reach for a card. The automatic movement of a man who had answered the world in writing for 10 years, and she watched him stop. That he set the pen down. That he sat for a moment looking at the desk, and she saw something she had not seen before, the struggle made visible. The thing usually kept entirely interior, surfacing just enough to show that it was there. His jaw was set in a way that was not the usual stillness. His hands were flat on the desk. Then he stood. He came around the desk and stood before her, closer than he usually stood. And she had to lift her face to his, and she saw in the grey eyes the whole of what Martha had described: the wound, the 10 years, the 22-year-old who had stood up in a room and said the true thing and been made to watch it do harm. And she saw underneath it, also, something else. Something that had not been in his eyes that first morning in the doorway. That I know why you brought me here. She said. Her voice was steady. She had worked to make it steady, and it held. Martha told me. I know about my mother and what you did and what it cost you. I know this was never simply a position. She paused. I know you have been carrying what happened to her for 10 years, and that you took me in because you could not take her debt to the grave unpaid. She looked at him. You have paid it. You have paid it a great many times over in the past 3 months. I am releasing you from the rest of it. She took a breath. Let me go. Let me take the talk with me when I go. Keep Martha her standing in Is county and yourself your work and the house its peace. It is the only thing I can do for any of you now, and I am asking you to let me do it. There was a silence. That it was different from the other silences. She had become fluent, over 3 months. In the silences of Thornfield she could read them the way she read the annotated pages, for what they contained, for what they were working through. This one was working through something large. She watched him pick up his pen from the desk. The movement of 10 years. The reflex so deep it had become structural. His hand closed around it, and then he looked at the pen. That he looked at it the way you looked at a thing you had been using so long you had stopped seeing it, and were now, for some reason, seeing clearly. And he set it down. Not quickly. With the deliberateness of a decision that he stood before her without the pen in his hand, and she understood that she was watching something it had cost him considerably to do, and she did not speak, when he spoke. His voice was rough. Not rough with coldness. Rough the way a door sounded when it had been closed for a long time and was being opened again, the slight resistance of a thing not recently used, the friction of disuse. It was the most effortful single syllable she had ever heard. No. He said. She looked at him that he took a breath. She could see the effort of it, the way a man breathed before doing something that required the whole of him. When he spoke again his voice was steadier, rough still but finding its register. Like a musician picking up an instrument after years and discovering that the knowledge was still there, changed by time but present. You will not go. He said. I have let you believe this was a debt. I let you believe it because a debt is a thing I know how to manage. I know how to pay in silence. I have paid everything in silence for 10 years because it was the only currency I still trusted. He stopped. His eyes did not leave hers. It was a debt. Once. It is not a debt now. It has not been a debt since he paused, and she saw him searching for when, the precise moment, the thing that would be true and not merely convenient. Since the second morning in the herb room. He said. When you wrote in the margin of your notebook that the standard preparation had a systemic error. That you believed you were the only one who had seen it. Something moved in his face. I had believed the same thing for 3 years. About that preparation and about a great deal else. You were the first person in 3 years to put a thought in front of me that required a response. He said it plainly. Without performance. I stopped answering the world in speech because I stopped believing that my speaking changed anything. I could not stop answering you. The pen was as close as I could come to explaining that without explaining it, Evelyn did not move. That I was a coward to let you go on thinking. It a debt, he said. It was easier than the alternative, and I chose easier, and that is a thing I am not going to do again. He paused. Lady Vane will not ruin you. I will not permit it, and I will not permit it in the way I have refused to try for 10 years. Which is by speaking where the damage was done, with the weight I did not have at 22, and the evidence I did not have then either. I have it now. He looked at her steadily. I have had it for 2 years. I was waiting for the right moment, and I told myself I was being prudent. And I have been taught this winter that there is a thing worse than speaking a truth that causes harm. His voice had steadied now, rough still, permanently roughened. But holding. It is keeping silent about a truth that would do good and calling the silence wisdom. I called it wisdom for 10 years. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, barely. The approach of something she had not yet seen on his face. It was fear. I believe you know something about fear of that kind. She did. She could not speak. Go to bed, Evelyn. His voice was quieter now. Trust me. And do not speak to me again of leaving. I find that I have got my voice back at an inconvenient time for anyone who wishes to argue with me. The almost smile again, more present now. And I have 10 years of things I have not said, and I intend to begin saying them. I would prefer to begin here. In this house, with some of them said to you. She stood in the middle of his study and she had done all the speaking for 3 months, she had been the voice of every morning in the herb room and every walk in the valley and every annotated page. And she found that she could not produce a single word. You see, he said more quietly. It is not so easy when it is your turn. She left the study, she stood in the corridor with her back to the wall and her hands flat against the plaster behind her and she breathed. The house was warm around her. Somewhere in the kitchen Martha was moving about. Outside the window the December lie. Tea was the same flat pewter white it had been all morning. She was staying. She had not been the one to decide it. She stood in the corridor and felt the particular sensation of a weight removed that you had carried so long you had stopped registering it as a weight, and she thought. He has 10 years of things to say, and I have been keeping the pages all winter, and we will see. She went back to the herb room. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top of it in her ordinary hand. Day one of the rest of the accounting, she left it open on the table where he would see it when he came in. The County Medical Society held its annual winter meeting in the second week of December, in the assembly rooms of the market town. And everyone who was anyone in the medical and gentry establishment of that part of Kent attended it. That year they came with the story of the Price girl and the silent Duke already well distributed among them. The way a good story always was by the time it reached an annual occasion where everyone was assembled to hear it simultaneously. Lady Vane was there, of course. She was always there. She had been a fixture of this gathering since her husband's time. When Sir Gerald had been its most distinguished member, and she wore the gathering the way she wore everything, as though it had been specifically arranged for her comfort, she had reason to be comfortable. She had spent 3 weeks very carefully making the ground safe. And the ground was safe. The Duke of Thornfield would sit at the edge of the room as he always sat. Because the Duke of Thornfield did not speak in public rooms and everyone knew it and had built their understanding of what was possible and impossible around that fact. Whatever happened this evening would happen in his silence. Which was the surest thing in Kent. She had built her entire plan on the silence of the Duke of Thornfield. Evelyn had not wished to come that he had asked her. Not written asked. The voice still rough at the edges, still finding its range, but present. I want you there. 3 words. And she had discovered she could refuse him nothing when he spent his hard-won words on the asking. She came in on Martha's arm, Martha who had said, when told they were attending, only good. With a compression that contained a great many other words, and the room received her with the specific quality of attention she had learned to read, heads not quite turning, conversations not quite continuing. The social body making its awareness of her known without committing to a direction, she held herself straight. She had always held herself straight. She and Martha found their place along the wall, and she looked at the far end of the room and bore the quality of the attention with the practice of a person who had been doing this since November, since 17 cold steps, since a cook who opened a door no wider. She bore it. She had borne worse. Across the room, Lady Vane stood at the center of a comfortable cluster of people and smiled her gracious smile, and once, only once, let her gaze travel to where Evelyn stood, and the gaze contained everything it needed to contain and moved on. The meeting opened. There were procedural matters, reports. A presentation on the management of winter fevers that contained 3 errors Evelyn could identify from where she sat. The room had the glazed, slightly restless quality of an audience waiting for the real event, which everyone understood to be the social occasion after and not the meeting itself. She was watching the door at the far end of the room when he came in. She knew, from a fortnight of hearing that voice relearn itself in the corridors of Thornfield, the sounds that preceded him. The particular quiet of his approach, the way a room registered his presence before it registered him. But the room did not know those sounds, and the room therefore perceived a sudden appearance. The Duke of Thornfield, who had been standing at the far edge for the past hour as he always stood, now crossing the floor of the assembly room with the unhurried directness of a man who knew exactly where he was going. She watched the room understand what it was seeing, slowly. The way a room processed a thing that did not fit the available categories. He was not leaving. He was not moving toward a private word. He was walking to where she stood. He came to her and he stood beside her deliberately, in the space next to her. So that the space now contained a duke, and her presence in it suddenly cost something to maintain, and he turned to face the room. It was very quiet. I owe you an apology, he said, to the room. And his voice carried the way voices carried in a room that had gone completely still to hear them. Several of you. I will try to be brief. He was not looking at Lady Vane. He was not looking at anyone in particular. He was looking at the room with the level directness of a man who has spent 10 years preparing to say a thing and has stopped being afraid of saying it. 12 years ago, he said, a woman died in this county who should not have died. Her name was Lady Bellington. She had been incorrectly diagnosed. And the treatment she received accelerated her decline. I was present at her case. I understood what was happening and I said so. I said so in this society. And I was laughed at. He paused. Some of you were there. I have no interest in embarrassing anyone who was young then and has since learned better. I am interested in the record. A stir moved through the room. He let it pass. The physician managing Lady Bellington's case, he said, was Sir Gerald Vane. The stir became something else. Evelyn watched the room reconfigure around that name. The way a room reconfigured when something it had taken as fixed was moved. Sir Gerald altered the documentation of the case after I submitted my assessment. I can demonstrate this. He reached into his coat and withdrew a packet, not large, bound with a piece of cord. What I have here is the original admission record from the Bellington case, recovered from the private papers of Sir Gerald's former clerk, who retained a copy without Sir Gerald's knowledge. I have a letter in Sir Gerald's own hand to an associate, discussing the management of the case. I have statements from 3 physicians who were present at the consultations and who have been willing to set down, in writing, what they observed. He set the packet on the nearest table. I also have the Harwich dispensary records of 1811, which are relevant to a secondary matter the society may wish to review at its convenience. That he looked at the room. Lady Bellington did not die because her case was complicated, he said. She died because the correct diagnosis was suppressed and the correct treatment was therefore withheld. Her daughter has been living with the consequences of a verdict that was wrong in every particular. I intend that to stop. His voice had not risen. It had not needed to. I have kept this evidence for 2 years. I told myself I was being prudent. I have recently been persuaded that prudence, in this case, was another word for something I am not going to call it any longer. He stopped. He looked once, briefly, at Evelyn, not for confirmation, she understood, but as a fact. The way you looked at the thing that was true when you were saying a true thing, and then he looked back at the room. That is all I have, he said. The documents are available to any member of this society who wishes to examine them. I would suggest the review committee meets before the end of the month. He sat down. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one that had preceded his speaking. It had weight and direction. Evelyn, standing against the wall, felt the room move around it, the way a current moved around a fixed point. And she watched it move toward the center of the room where Lady Vane was standing. Lady Vane was still. She was standing with the stillness of a woman who has had the ground removed from under her and has not yet committed to the direction of the fall. Her face was composed. She was accomplished at composure, but the smile was gone. What remained was what the smile had been covering, which was the face of a woman who had spent 30 years guarding something and had just watched it be opened in front of everyone she knew. She did not speak. There was nothing gracious to say. She gathered herself, which took a moment. And she walked toward the door with the controlled movement of a woman who would not run, and the crowd parted for her as crowds parted for people doing something everyone understood and no one wished to acknowledge, and the door closed behind her. Evelyn let out a breath. Martha, beside her, said nothing. She put her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm and then removed it, which was Martha's way of saying a great deal. Later, much later, in the cold carriage going back to Thornfield, the 3 of them in the dark with the sound of the horses on the frozen road, Martha fell asleep with the immediacy of a woman who had been carrying considerable tension and had now set it down. The Duke was across from Evelyn in the dark. She could not see his face. She reached into the bag she had carried and found by touch the bundle of folded pages she had put there that morning. She had not known, when she put them there, exactly why. She knew now. She held the bundle out across the dark space between them. She felt him take it. His hands found hers briefly, locating the thing she was offering, and she felt the folded papers pass from her hands to his. Every annotation, she said quietly. The entire winter. I have been keeping them. She paused. I kept them before I understood why. I think I understood before I understood. If you take my meaning, the carriage was very quiet except for the road. You were not the only one, she said. You wrote that, in October. About the Harwich records. About believing you were alone in what you saw. She looked toward where she knew his face to be in the dark. You were not. You were only the one without the right room in which to say it. She paused. You had the right room all along. You had made it yourself. You only nay. Dead someone in it who knew how to hear you. That he did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice had the quality it had in the early morning in the herb room, not performed, not effortful, only present. The voice of a man who had stopped spending each word as though it might be his last. That I know. He said. I have known since October. I have been trying to find the right words for it since then. A pause. I find I am still not entirely fluent. I expect that will take some time. That I have time, Evelyn said. Yes, he said. I know that too. The carriage went on through the December dark. And the road was long, and the bundle of annotated pages was in his hands, and Martha slept across from them with the contentment of a woman who had, she would later maintain, arranged the entire thing. That I and the morning Evelyn came down to the herb room at the usual hour and found, on the table, all the folded pages returned, and with them one more. The new page was not from her notebook. It was a single sheet of the good plain paper he used for correspondence. That it said. I have been told I owe you the words I wrote when I could not speak them. I intend to begin paying that debt in the medium I have now recovered. This is the first installment. There are, as I indicated, 10 years' worth that I find I am ready to begin. If you are that she sat down, she took up her pen, she wrote. I have been ready since October. I was waiting for you to catch up. She left it open on the table. Half an hour later she heard the quiet step in the corridor. The door opened. He came to his end of the table and looked at what she had written. And she heard, she was almost entirely certain she heard a low, brief sound that had not been in the herb room before. She did not look up. She was smiling at her jars. She thought she did not need to look up to know that he was, too,